She stopped a Millionaire CEO outside his office and said, "Daddy, they took Mommy to court, but he didn't even know he had a daughter." The morning had started like any other for Evan Miller. As the CEO of one of Manhattan's most powerful real estate firms, his days were carefully structured, saturated with meetings, calls, and decisions that moved millions. He walked briskly along the sidewalk outside his glass-clad headquarters, dressed in a pale tailored suit that contrasted with his dark brown hair and deep-set brown eyes. His assistant trailed a few steps behind, listing calendar updates, but Evan barely heard her. His focus was glued to the screen of his phone as he reviewed a contract revision sent from overseas. His world at that moment was pure business, efficient, logical, and entirely under control until he heard a small voice say something that stopped him cold. "Daddy, they took Mommy to court." He froze mid-step. The voice hadn't come from his assistant or anyone passing by. It was soft, unsure, but distinct. Slowly, he lowered his phone and turned his head toward the sound. Standing just a few feet away was a little girl, no older than 7, with wavy blonde hair and large brown eyes filled with something too heavy for someone her age. She wore a light pink dress and clutched the hand of a smaller girl, maybe 4 years old, dressed in yellow with bright blue eyes and curls that framed her cherubic face. Evan stared at them confused, then looked around as if this were some kind of prank. The sidewalk was busy. People passed without paying attention. But the girls didn't move. The older one just looked up at him with unbearable seriousness. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cautious. The older girl took a small breath and repeated, "Mommy's in court. She's in trouble. We came to find you." He shook his head slightly, frowning. "I don't have children," he said automatically. "I think you've made a mistake." The girl didn't flinch. Instead, she carefully reached into a small pink backpack and pulled out a folded photograph. She stepped forward, raising it with both hands. Evan hesitated, but curiosity overtook him. He took the photo and looked at it. His heart dropped. It was Rachel. Her hair was shorter, her eyes older, but there was no doubt it was her. The woman he had once loved desperately, stupidly, and whom he hadn't seen in 7 years. The breakup had been sudden and final. He thought she'd moved on, disappeared into another life. And she had, just not in the way he imagined. "She's my mom," the girl said softly. "And I'm Sophie. This is Lucy. She's my little sister." Evan's grip tightened on the photo. His mind raced. If Rachel had a daughter, this daughter, and if she was 7 years old, his eyes returned to Sophie. Her features, her gaze. There was no denying it now. She looked like him, the shape of her eyes, her chin, the set of her mouth. All the signs were there, undeniable and overwhelming. He staggered back slightly, stunned. "You're saying I'm your father?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Sophie nodded. "Mom never told you." "I think she was scared. But she always said your name. I knew who you were when I saw you in the picture on the building." He remembered the real estate campaign. His face plastered across billboards for a new luxury development. That was how Sophie found him. "I didn't know," he muttered more to himself than anyone else. "I didn't even know." Sophie seemed to hesitate, then added, "Lucy's dad is my stepdad. He's the reason Mommy's in court. He wants to take Lucy away from her. He hurts Mommy. Sometimes us, too. So we ran, and when the police came, they took Mommy and we didn't know what else to do. So we came here." Evan felt the world shift beneath him. A moment ago he was a man of logic and numbers. Now he was standing face to face with a daughter he never knew existed and a frightened little girl who wasn't even his, but whose wide blue eyes clung to him like he was their only hope. He looked at both girls. They were tired. They had likely walked a long way. Their shoes were scuffed. Their clothes, though clean, looked worn and stretched from too much use. Sophie was still standing tall, trying to be brave. Lucy leaned into her older sister, eyes flicking between Evan and the crowds behind them. He couldn't leave them there. Whatever the truth was, whatever anger or betrayal he might feel toward Rachel, none of that mattered right now. These girls needed help. He bent down slightly, his voice gentler now. Do you want to come inside with me? We'll get you something to eat and we'll figure this out. Okay. Sophie gave a small nod. She didn't smile. She didn't show relief, but she trusted him enough to follow. As he led them into the building, the security guard stared, stunned, but said nothing. Evan didn't explain. He couldn't. His mind was a hurricane. His past had just walked straight into his future and brought with it two little girls who were about to change everything. Inside the towering glass lobby of Miller and Company, everything was still and pristine. Too pristine for two tired little girls and a man who suddenly felt like his life had broken free from the rails. Evan walked swiftly through the security checkpoint, the older girl, Sophie, at his side, clutching the hand of her sister, Lucy, who lagged behind with sleepy steps. The marble floors echoed under their shoes as they made their way to the private elevator reserved for executive access. No one stopped him. No one asked questions. He was Evan Miller. No one questioned him. But for the first time in years, he wished someone would. He needed someone to help him process what had just happened. The elevator ride was silent. Sophie didn't ask where they were going, and Lucy leaned against the wall, blinking slowly like she might fall asleep standing up. Evan glanced down at them and realized they must not have eaten or slept or felt safe in a long time. A stab of guilt cut through him, irrational but overwhelming. He didn't know these girls, but somehow they were his responsibility now. At least one of them was, and the other had no one else. They entered his executive suite on the top floor. It was sleek, modern, and completely devoid of anything resembling childhood. The walls were lined with glass shelves and awards. The furniture was all steel and leather, and the only sound was the quiet hum of the HVAC. Evan had built it to impress board members, not to comfort children. He suddenly hated it. Come sit, he said quietly, motioning toward a couch that looked far too formal for two children to rest on. Still, Sophie obeyed, helping Lucy up beside her and brushing the younger girl's hair back with careful fingers. That simple gesture, gentle, practiced, made Evan's throat tighten. She'd been doing this far too long. She shouldn't have to be a mother to her own sister. I'll get food, he said quickly, and stepped into the break area, rummaging through the kitchenette. He found bottled water, crackers, and a few snack bars. Not much, but enough for now. He returned and handed the water to Sophie, who took it and gave Lucy the first drink. She didn't even open her own until Lucy had finished half the bottle. Evan sat across from them, elbows on his knees, trying to speak calmly, even as his mind raced. I need to understand what happened, he said. Can you tell me everything from the beginning? Sophie nodded. She looked older than 7 now. Calmer than most adults might be in her position. Mommy was trying to leave, she began, her voice soft. Greg, Lucy's dad, he started being mean when Lucy was still a baby. Yelling, throwing things, sometimes hitting Mommy. Then he started yelling at us, too. I tried to hide Lucy when he was angry. Evan felt a slow burn rise in his chest. He clenched his jaw but stayed silent. Mom tried to get help. She called someone once but Greg found out. He broke her phone. She didn't call again. He said if she ever left, he'd take Lucy and say Mommy was crazy. So, we stayed. She was scared. But one day, he pushed her too hard. And I screamed really loud. A neighbor came and called the police. Sophie paused, looked down at her hands. They came, but Greg told them it was all lies. Mommy was crying and couldn't talk right, so they took her. Said she might be dangerous. They said Lucy should go with Greg, but Mommy begged them not to. She told me to run, so I ran. I grabbed Lucy and left before they could take us. I remembered your name. I saw you once on a billboard downtown, so I found your office. Evan couldn't move. Couldn't breathe for a moment. The image of a 7-year-old grabbing her baby sister and fleeing into the streets of New York was more than heartbreaking. It was horrifying. He leaned back, covering his mouth with one hand, the other gripping his knee so tightly his knuckles widened. And Rachel. She never told me about you. He said finally. Sophie shrugged a little, but there was no blame in her voice. She wanted to. I think. But she always said you were too busy and important. And that if you knew, maybe you'd be mad. He didn't know what to say. Maybe he would have been angry. Maybe he wouldn't have believed it. Maybe Rachel had been right to fear his reaction. But none of it mattered now. I believe you, he said quietly. And I'm not mad. I'm trying to fix this. Sophie gave him a long look like she was measuring the truth in his voice. Then slowly, she nodded. Evan stood and pulled out his phone, pacing the room as he spoke to his assistant in a low, firm tone. I need our legal team now. Track down which court Rachel Carson is being held in. I want a family attorney on this case within the hour and call Detective Harris. We'll need his connections. He hung up and looked back at the girls. Lucy was asleep now, curled against her sister. Sophie was still watching him like she wasn't sure if the spell would break. I'm going to help your mom, he told her. And I'm going to help you. You don't have to do this alone anymore. For a moment, she didn't react. Then she leaned back on the couch, gently resting her head against Lucy's and whispered, okay. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And for Evan Miller, who had spent his life chasing control and power, it felt like the first real thing he'd done in years. The next few hours passed in a blur. Evan had faced billion-dollar negotiations, global mergers, and high-press boardroom standoffs, but none of them compared to the storm of emotion he was caught in now. His legal team arrived quickly, sensing the urgency in his voice, though none of them dared ask who the children were. Their professionalism couldn't hide the surprise in their eyes when they saw the two girls asleep on the couch in his office. One nestled into the other, both looking impossibly small against the backdrop of a world built for adults. Evan briefed them sharply, clearly without letting his emotions surface too much. He explained that Rachel Carson, the mother of the children, had been taken into custody during a domestic disturbance. The stepfather, Greg Bennett, had filed for custody of Lucy, the younger child, and was using claims of instability to push Rachel out of the picture completely. Evan didn't share everything. Not yet. He didn't mention that Sophie was his daughter or that he had only just discovered her existence. That part felt too personal, too fragile to give to anyone else just yet. By late afternoon, one of the firm's attorneys had located Rachel's hearing, family court downtown, scheduled for the next morning. Rachel was still being held under temporary evaluation, not criminal charges. But Greg's legal team was moving fast to gain emergency custody of Lucy. The system, overwhelmed and imperfect, had bought into Greg's version of the story for now. Evan stood at the wide windows of his office, looking down at the blur of yellow cabs and pedestrians below. His city, his kingdom, suddenly felt cold and distant. Behind him, the girls were still asleep, and the quiet sound of their breathing was the only thing anchoring him to the moment. He turned when he heard soft footsteps. Sophie had woken and was gently easing herself off the couch, trying not to disturb Lucy. She looked around and met his gaze. Her face was unreadable, serious beyond her ears. Is Mommy okay? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Evan walked over, crouching down, so they were eye level. She's okay. She's safe for now. We found her. She's still in custody, but we're going to court tomorrow to make sure she's not alone there. Sophie nodded slowly, and for the first time a flicker of relief passed across her face, but it vanished just as quickly. Greg lies, she said. He makes things sound nice when people are listening. But then he changes. Evan felt anger rise again, slow and controlled. You don't have to worry about him. I've hired people who will make sure he doesn't hurt your mom or either of you again. Will you be there? She asked suddenly at court. Of course, he said without hesitation. I'll be sitting right behind your mom. There was a long pause. Then she looked away and murmured. She's not perfect. But she tried. She really tried. Evan didn't answer right away. He thought of Rachel as he had last seen her years ago, standing in the rain outside their apartment, her voice breaking as she told him she couldn't do this anymore. Back then, he had assumed it was over something trivial. A fight, a difference in ambition. He had no idea she'd been carrying the secret of a child. And now, standing here hearing their daughter defend her, he realized just how little he'd understood. He reached out, gently, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. We all make mistakes. But trying to do the right thing still matters. That's why we're going to help her. The rest of the evening was quiet. Evan arranged for a private driver to take them to his apartment, a sleek high-rise on the Upper West Side that had always felt more like a museum than a home. But now with the girls trailing behind him and their small voices echoing in the empty space, the walls felt less sterile. He showed them to the guest rooms and had his housekeeper prepare a warm meal. Lucy ate without much energy, but Sophie remained alert, watching everything, still not quite convinced that this safety was permanent. After dinner, while the girls were being settled in, Evan returned to his home office and stood staring at the fireplace. He held the photograph Sophie had given him earlier. Rachel looked tired in the image, but happy. Sophie, as a baby, was on her hip, smiling. He stared at the child's face, seeing his own eyes, his own mouth, and felt something shift inside him. A kind of silent grief for the years he'd missed. For the bedtime stories never told, the birthdays he hadn't attended, the scraped knees he hadn't soothed. He could never get that time back, but he could fight now. He picked up the phone and dialed Detective Harris directly. The man had helped him discreetly during corporate investigations before. Background checks, private matters. But this time, Evan's voice was different. I need you to dig into someone named Greg Bennett, he said. Family court case. I want everything. Records, complaints, ex-wives, restraining orders, anything. I don't care how small it looks. I'm protecting 2 children and their mother, and I won't let the wrong man win. After a long pause, Harris replied, Understood. You'll have something by morning. Evan ended the call and stood in the silence of his office. His life had changed in a single afternoon. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't expected it, but deep down he knew he wouldn't walk away from it either. In the next room, Sophie was finally asleep, curled next to her sister in a bed too big for them both. And for the first time in years, Evan Miller wasn't thinking about profit margins or market projections. He was thinking about how to keep 2 little girls safe and how to earn the right to be called a father. The next morning came with a heavy gray sky that hung over the city like a warning. Evan Miller stood at the window of his penthouse apartment, coffee in hand, watching the streets below begin to stir. The early light cast soft shadows through the tall windows, and the usual thrill he got from the Manhattan skyline was gone. Today wasn't about business. It wasn't about power or headlines or investment deals. It was about showing up for someone he'd unknowingly abandoned, and for a woman who had been carrying the weight of too much for far too long. In the bedroom down the hall, the girls were waking slowly. Lucy whimpered once in her sleep, and Sophie, already half-dressed, moved instantly to her side. Evan watched from the doorway unnoticed. The way Sophie comforted her sister was not something she had learned in school or in playgroups. It was something that came from necessity, from too many nights without protection, from being the only person Lucy could count on. It hurt to watch. A child that small should not have had to become someone's shield. After breakfast, they dressed quietly and left the apartment in Evan's car with his driver, heading downtown toward the family courthouse. He had already coordinated with his legal team. Rachel would be present in a hearing that would determine whether Lucy would be released into Greg's custody pending full custody litigation. The decision could be made in a matter of minutes if no one contested it. And until yesterday, there had been no one to stand in Rachel's defense. She had been painted as unstable, unfit, overwhelmed, without support, and it had nearly worked. As they pulled up to the courthouse, Evan glanced at Sophie in the rear seat. She was sitting very still, holding Lucy's hand tightly. Her face betrayed nothing, but her other hand trembled slightly in her lap. He reached out gently, palm up, and after a brief pause, she placed her hand in his. Neither of them said anything, but the gesture stayed. Inside the courthouse, everything smelled of old carpet and overpolished wood. Families sat on benches, lawyers whispered in corners, and bailiffs called names with dispassion. It was a place where futures were reshaped every hour, often without ceremony or compassion. Evan hated it immediately. Rachel was already in the small courtroom when they arrived. She sat at the defendant's table looking tired and much thinner than he remembered. Her hair was tied back loosely, and she wore a simple blouse that looked borrowed. When she turned and saw Sophie and Lucy walk in, her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes welled up. She hadn't known if she'd ever see them again. Evan stepped forward, and for a moment, Rachel looked stunned to see him there. Their eyes met, and there was a flash of history between them. Grief, confusion, unfinished conversations. But none of that mattered right now. He gave her a slight nod. It was enough. The judge entered, a woman in her late 50s with a reputation for efficiency and little patience for dramatics. Judge Margaret Brooks. She called the case number and the proceedings began. Greg sat at the other table dressed in a suit, his face calm, confident. He didn't even look at Rachel. His attorney began speaking immediately, describing Rachel as mentally unstable, unwell, emotionally erratic, citing a single prior report from a neighbor and emphasizing her recent detainment as proof she was unfit to care for Lucy. He suggested emergency placement with Greg until further psychological evaluation could be completed. Rachel's court-appointed attorney began to object, but her voice was uncertain and she stumbled over her words. Evan felt his anger rise. He stood. "Your Honor," he said firmly, and the judge glanced up over her glasses. "Mr. Miller, you are not on the docket to speak." "I know, but I request to be heard as a material party." "My name is Evan Miller. I am the biological father of the older child, Sophie, and I am here today because the information presented about Rachel Carson is incomplete, misleading, and intentionally damaging." The courtroom shifted. Even Greg blinked in surprise. "I have known about Sophie for less than 24 hours, Evan continued. "But I have already seen enough to know Rachel has been fighting alone for years. I have heard from our daughter about the emotional and physical abuse she and her sister have suffered in the home of Mr. Bennett. I have engaged legal counsel, private investigation, and offered my support as a co-parent. I am requesting the court deny temporary custody to Greg Bennett and instead consider granting joint guardianship of both children to Rachel Carson and myself until further review." There was silence in the room. The judge studied him carefully, her fingers tapping slowly against the wood of the bench. "Do you have documentation of paternity?" "We have initiated DNA testing. In the meantime, we are requesting a temporary protective arrangement. I am prepared to house both children in a secure environment, and I have the resources to support this family while investigations continue." Rachel looked down at the table, trying to contain her emotion. Her hands were shaking. Evan glanced over and saw Sophie clinging to Lucy in the front row, eyes wide but hopeful. The judge called for a brief recess. When she returned, she spoke with authority and clarity. "In the interest of the children's safety, and based on the evidence presented and the credible testimony of Mr. Miller, I am denying Mr. Bennett's petition for temporary custody. Effective immediately, the court grants temporary joint guardianship of both minors to Rachel Carson and Evan Miller." Mr. Bennet is issued a restraining order and may not have contact with either child until further review. Rachel let out a quiet, almost inaudible sob. Sophie turned and hugged Lucy tightly. Evan stood frozen for a moment, stunned not by the victory, but by the weight of it. He had just taken on the lives of 2 little girls and something else entirely. A second chance, one he never thought he'd have. As the courtroom cleared, Rachel slowly approached him. She looked exhausted, and there were so many words waiting to be said between them, but she only managed one. "Thank you," he nodded. "We'll figure the rest out later. For now, you're going home with your daughters." And in that moment, it was clear nothing would ever be the same again. The ride back to Evan's apartment that afternoon was unlike the one they had taken earlier. There was still a certain heaviness in the air, but it was no longer made of fear. It had been replaced by something fragile, but real hope. Rachel sat in the back seat next to her daughters, both of whom leaned against her as if their bodies instinctively remembered the comfort they had nearly lost. Sophie held Rachel's hand without letting go, while Lucy rested her head on her mother's lap and closed her eyes, the chaos of the courtroom finally catching up with her. Evan sat in the front seat, his thoughts tangled. The hearing had gone as well as it possibly could have, but he knew that what lay ahead wouldn't be simple. Legal guardianship was temporary. Investigations were still pending. And just because the judge had made a ruling didn't mean Rachel was safe from scrutiny or from Greg's manipulation. He also knew that emotionally things were far more complex. These weren't just logistics. They were lives, traumas, relationships frozen in time and suddenly forced to thaw. When they arrived at the apartment, the girls immediately gravitated to the familiar space. Lucy headed straight for the soft blankets on the couch while Sophie gently guided her mother toward the kitchen and asked, "Are you hungry?" The question, simple as it was, held layers beneath it. It wasn't just about food. It was about control, about reassurance, about finally being able to take care of someone who had always tried to take care of her. Rachel gave a weak smile and nodded. "A little," she said. Evan watched the interaction from the hallway, unsure whether to step in or give them space. Part of him still felt like an outsider despite everything he had done in the past 24 hours. He had jumped into action, hired lawyers, challenged a custody battle, but now that things were quiet, he didn't know where he fit in this family. Rachel noticed his hesitation and walked over to him. "Thank you again," she said softly, her voice slightly. "I know I keep saying that, but I don't really have the words." He nodded. "You don't need to thank me. Not for this." She glanced around the apartment, her eyes lingering on the high ceilings, the view of the skyline, the elegant but now gently lived-in space. "This place. It doesn't feel cold," she said. "I thought it would." "It used to," Evan replied before they came. Rachel smiled and something softened between them. A shared understanding of what had been lost and what might still be possible to recover. Over dinner, Rachel ate slowly, more to show the girls that she was okay than because she had any real appetite. Sophie stayed close, always glancing at her mother's plate, nudging her gently to finish her vegetables. Lucy, half asleep, leaned on Evan's arm while holding a spoon like a toy rather than a utensil. He didn't move her. He just let her rest. After the girls were put to bed, Rachel joined Evan in the living room. The city lights shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the room was wrapped in a calm that had felt impossible just 24 hours earlier. She sat with her knees tucked under her, wearing one of the oversized sweaters Evan's housekeeper had found for her. He offered her a mug of tea and sat across from her, watching the steam rise between them. "I want to explain," she began, staring at her hands. "You don't have to," he said quickly. But she shook her head. "I do. You deserve that at least." She took a breath and looked at him. "When I found out I was pregnant with Sophie, I panicked. We were already breaking apart, and I thought if I told you, you'd feel trapped. I didn't want to be someone who ruined your career, your life. So, I left. I thought I was doing the right thing. And for a while, maybe I believed it. He said nothing. He couldn't. Every word was like a cut. Clean, honest, and long overdue. Then Greg came into the picture. He seemed kind at first, dependable. He helped me raise Sophie, treated her like his own. But things changed after Lucy was born. He grew cold, controlling, he drank, and then the yelling started, then worse. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. I tried to leave more times than I can count, but every time he threatened to take Lucy. He said no one would believe me, that I was already unstable, a single mom with no family. And maybe I believe that, too. Evan finally spoke. You should have told me. I know, she said quietly. But I didn't know how to fix it once it was broken. I just tried to survive. They sat in silence for a long while after that. Not uncomfortable silence, but the kind that follows truth. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the beginning of something that could lead there. I'm not going to disappear, Evan said finally. I don't want this to be temporary. Rachel nodded. I don't want it to be either. They didn't make promises. Neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring. But they both understood that something real had been placed in their hands now, and they couldn't drop it. As midnight approached, Evan checked on the girls one last time. Sophie was curled around Lucy protectively, both breathing softly in sync. He stood at the doorway for a long time, and when he finally walked away, he didn't feel like a stranger anymore. He felt like he belonged. Not because of blood or law, but because he had chosen to stay. Morning came with a soft golden light pouring through the tall windows of Evan's apartment, but the warmth of the sun did little to calm the uneasy energy that had settled in the air. It wasn't tension exactly. It was more like a deep collective exhaustion. The kind that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much for too long. The girls woke slowly. Sophie helped Lucy brush her hair while Rachel stood quietly by the kitchen counter, staring into her tea as if it might offer answers to questions she still hadn't found the courage to ask. Evan watched all of this from a quiet distance, unsure how to fit into this family rhythm that had formed without him, but desperate to be a part of it anyway. He spent the morning on the phone with his legal team and Detective Harris. Overnight, Harris had uncovered several disturbing patterns in Greg Bennett's past. 2 prior relationships with allegations of emotional abuse, 1 restraining order that had been quietly dismissed, and a dismissed CPS report from 3 years ago that had been closed before a full investigation was conducted. It was enough to form a clear picture of a man who knew how to manipulate systems and people. Evan listened in silence, his jaw tight, then asked Harris to dig deeper. He wanted anything that could be used to permanently remove Greg from their lives. Meanwhile, Rachel tried to re-establish a sense of normalcy for the girls. She spent most of the morning sitting on the floor with Lucy, playing with blocks, her voice soft and patient as she named the colors and shapes. But even then, her eyes kept flicking to the door, to the phone, to Sophie, anywhere that might signal danger or another unexpected twist. Trauma had made her hyper-aware, alert to things no one should have to live in constant fear of. Sophie too carried the same weight, though she tried to hide it. She asked for reassurance in subtle ways, who would pick her up if they went out, who would hold the keys, whether the doors were locked. Later that day, a social worker from Family Services arrived for an in-home visit. It was routine under the court's order, but that didn't make it any less stressful. Evan answered the door, greeted her politely, and led her inside. Rachel sat straight back on the couch with Lucy in her lap while Sophie sat beside her, holding her hand tightly. The social worker, a woman named Carla, with a warm but firm presence, asked a long series of questions about their routine, their meals, sleeping arrangements, school history, and the events leading up to the court hearing. Rachel answered with quiet dignity, never playing the victim, never dramatizing her experience, just telling the truth. Sophie, when asked, spoke clearly, but with an edge of distance, as if she didn't want to say too much for fear it might be used against them later. Evan noticed and stepped in gently where needed, offering factual support without overshadowing Rachel's voice. After the social worker left, Rachel disappeared into the guest room and closed the door. Evan waited a few minutes before knocking lightly and stepping in. She was sitting on the bed, staring out the window. She didn't turn around when he entered. "I hate feeling inspected," she said, like they're measuring if I'm worth keeping my own children. He sat down beside her but didn't respond right away. He understood. There was no way to describe that feeling unless you've been through it. "They don't know you," he said eventually. "But I do. And Sophie does. That matters more." Rachel turned to him, her eyes tired. "I keep thinking that maybe they'd be better off without me. You could raise them. Give them a safer life, cleaner, easier." Evan didn't hesitate. "Don't ever say that again. They don't just need safety. They need you. Lucy clings to you like you're her entire world. Sophie would tear the walls down if someone tried to take you away. You don't see it because you've been too busy surviving, but they love you with everything they have. And so do I." The last part came out before he could stop it. Rachel blinked, her lips parting slightly in surprise. It wasn't a confession meant to complicate things. It was just the truth, simple, quiet, and raw. They sat in silence for a moment, and though she didn't say it back, she reached over and took his hand. That evening, they had dinner as a family. Not because it was planned, but because it felt necessary. The four of them sat around Evan's large table, once a sterile space for executives and catered lunches, now cluttered with mismatched cups and tiny forks. Lucy ate spaghetti with her hands. Sophie told a story from a book she remembered from kindergarten. Rachel laughed, really laughed, for the first time since she had arrived. And Evan sat back watching all of it unfold like a man who had finally found the thing he hadn't known he'd been missing. Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Rachel and Evan stepped out onto the balcony. The city stretched before them, glittering and endless. The air was warm, but not heavy, and for once, the silence between them wasn't filled with things left unsaid. It was comfortable. "We're not out of this yet," she said softly. "Greg isn't going to give up." "I know," Evan replied. "But he doesn't get to win this time." She nodded, then looked at him with something different in her eyes. Not fear, not apology, but trust. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," he said. "But we'll do it scared together." And in that quiet moment, as the city moved on far below them, they both realized something. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rebuilding something worth living for, something whole, something lasting. The day of Greg Bennett's formal hearing arrived with the same overcast skies that had become all too familiar since this ordeal began. The morning felt tense from the moment everyone woke up. Even the girls, who had slowly started to settle into a rhythm of laughter and play, moved quietly through the apartment, picking at their breakfast and staying close to Rachel without asking why. Sophie didn't speak much, but her eyes followed Rachel and Evan everywhere they went, needing the reassurance of their presence. Lucy clung to her mother's hip, even refusing her favorite toy if it meant letting go. The weight of the day was something even the youngest could feel. Rachel dressed carefully, wearing the same modest dress she had worn during the initial custody hearing. She had washed it the night before, smoothing out every crease as though each wrinkle could be interpreted as carelessness. Her hands trembled as she pulled her hair into a low bun. She didn't want pity. She wanted strength, but she wasn't sure she could summon it again. Evan noticed, quietly stepped behind her, and rested a steadying hand on her back as she looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror. "You're not alone today," he said. She met his eyes in the mirror and nodded. Just that, a nod. But it was enough to get her moving. At the courthouse, the energy was different from the previous hearing. It was heavier, more formal. This time, the focus was on Greg, on his record, his behavior, his threats, and his history. Rachel's attorney, bolstered by the recent work of Evan's legal team and the reports from Detective Harris, stood with renewed confidence. They had spent the last several days compiling statements from past neighbors, screenshots of threatening texts, and testimony from a former girlfriend of Greg's, who had come forward after hearing about the case in the news. Everything was finally converging. Rachel sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Evan sat directly behind her with Sophie on his left and Lucy on his right, drawing quietly on a notepad with colored pencils Rachel had packed in her purse. The girls weren't called to testify this time. Evan had insisted they be present only as a symbol of unity and protection, not as pawns in a courtroom. The judge allowed it under the condition that they remained quiet and were removed if the proceedings became too intense. Greg walked in last, smug in a dark navy suit, flanked by a high-priced attorney who had tried more than once to settle this quietly. But the public scrutiny had made that impossible. Too many people were watching now, and Greg's mask of control began to slip even before he reached the defense table. His confidence faltered when he saw Evan there, calm and immovable. He faltered again when he caught Rachel's eyes, no longer full of fear, but determination. The hearing began with statements from both legal teams. Rachel's side focused on the pattern of coercion and emotional abuse, and they were backed by hard evidence. Now, a neighbor who had been too afraid to speak earlier had submitted a sworn statement describing the sounds of yelling, objects breaking, and Rachel sobbing late into the night. Greg's text messages were displayed on a screen, some filled with insults, others with manipulation. In one, he threatened to take Lucy and raise her to forget you ever existed. Then came the most impactful moment of the hearing. Detective Harris took the stand. Calm and methodical, he walked the court through the timeline of complaints against Greg, focusing on the missed red flags, the closed cases, and the disturbing consistency of Greg's behavior across multiple relationships. Greg's lawyer attempted to discredit the testimonies. He pointed out that no criminal charges had ever stuck, that Rachel had remained in the relationship for years, and that Evan's sudden reappearance as a father was suspiciously convenient. But none of it worked. The judge, experienced and sharp, saw through it. She interrupted at one point, raising an eyebrow as she looked directly at Greg. So, what you're telling this court is that in every one of these unrelated cases, multiple women, different cities, the problem was them and not you. Greg's mouth opened, but he didn't respond fast enough. The silence said more than words. In her final statement, Rachel stood on shaky legs, refusing her attorney's offer to speak on her behalf. She looked directly at the judge, then down at Lucy, then Sophie. "I'm not perfect," she began. "I've made mistakes. I stayed when I should have left. I believe things I shouldn't have, but I never stopped protecting my girls. I carried the fear every day. I gave up everything to keep them safe, even if it meant letting them go. And I'm standing here now, not because I think I'm better than him, but because I know what love is supposed to feel like. And my daughters, they deserve that kind of love, not fear." Silence filled the courtroom as she stepped back. The judge didn't respond immediately. She looked down at the papers in front of her, then up at the faces in the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "This court finds that Greg Bennett poses a credible threat to the safety and emotional well-being of both minors. His petition for custody is denied permanently. A restraining order is hereby extended for a period of 5 years. The court recognizes Evan Miller and Rachel Carson as joint legal guardians of Sophie Miller and Lucy Carson effective immediately." Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She turned and before she could say anything, Sophie jumped up and hugged her. Lucy followed a moment later, pressing her face into Rachel's side. Evan stood, not saying a word, just placing a protective arm around all three of them. Greg sat still at the table, red-faced, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. But no one paid him attention anymore. His time was over. Outside the courthouse, the sky had finally begun to clear. Rachel stood on the steps, the girls on either side of her, and Evan just behind, watching quietly. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future wasn't uncertain. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Rachel turned to Evan. Her voice was quiet, but full. "I don't know what happens next," she said. He smiled. "We write it." And together they walked away, not just from the courthouse, but from the shadow that had followed them for years. Summer arrived slowly, as if even the weather understood the family needed time to breathe. After the final hearing, after the courtroom doors closed and Greg Bennett's shadow was finally behind them, the days began to unfold differently. It wasn't dramatic. No parades or fairy tale endings, just quiet change. Healing, slow and stubborn, took root not in grand gestures, but in the subtle softness of everyday life. Evan's once sterile penthouse began to truly transform, not just physically, but emotionally. The sharp edges of glass and metal were now softened by blankets tossed over the couch, small socks in the laundry, coloring books on the floor. The scent of pancakes or soup often replaced the sterile echo of catered meals. Rachel began to reclaim her rhythm. At first, she moved through the apartment as if on borrowed time, unsure if she belonged, still carrying years of fear that it would all be ripped away. But Evan never wavered. He gave her space when she needed it, support when she asked for none, and quiet understanding in the moments when words failed her. The girls thrived. Lucy began to laugh again. Real careless laughter. She danced in the hallway, made up songs with wild, wonderful lyrics, and demanded bedtime stories with dragons and cupcakes and outer space. Sophie, who had grown so used to being the protector, finally allowed herself to be a child. She began sleeping through the night, stopped checking the locks before bed and started asking Rachel if she could have friends over. Her eyes, once always scanning for danger, now lit up at the mention of ice cream or Saturday movies. Rachel enrolled both girls in school for the fall. Lucy would start preschool, and Sophie would begin second grade. They visited the school together as a family. Evan came too, wearing a button-up shirt with no tie and sneakers instead of dress shoes, something Sophie teased him about for an entire day. One morning, just a few weeks after the court ruling, Evan found himself sitting on the floor with Lucy on his shoulders, Sophie braiding Rachel's hair, and laughter echoing through the apartment like it had lived there all along. It hit him then, not as a sudden epiphany, but as something quietly undeniable. This was home, not the one he built with glass and steel, but the one forged through chaos and pain and unwavering choice. One night after the girls had gone to sleep and the apartment had fallen into a deep hush, Rachel stood on the balcony watching the lights of the city. Evan joined her, leaning on the railing beside her. They said nothing for a while. The air was warm, the hum of traffic distant. She turned to him slowly. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Missing those years," he replied. "Yes, I think I always will, but I don't regret showing up when it counted." She nodded. "I used to think I ruined everything by keeping Sophie from you. By getting involved with Greg, I thought if I stayed quiet, I could contain the damage." Evan looked at her then, not with blame or anger, but with that steady gaze he'd given her the first day she returned. "You survived it," he said. "And you saved them. You gave them the best of you, even when you had nothing left." Rachel blinked quickly and smiled in a way that was more grateful than happy. "I don't know how to live without fear yet." "Then we live with it," he said simply. "But we live." As weeks turned to months, the apartment turned into a real home. Not a temporary shelter, not a legal arrangement, but a place filled with routines and rituals that only made sense to them. Sunday pancakes became tradition. Friday movie nights with popcorn and mismatched pajamas were non-negotiable. They took turns burning dinner and laughing about it. Lucy once spilled juice on a contract Evan had brought home. He framed the page instead of throwing it out. On Sophie's 8th birthday, Rachel baked a lopsided chocolate cake that the girls declared the best in the universe. Evan gave Sophie a necklace with her name engraved next to the word brave. She wore it every day. There were still hard days. Rachel had panic attacks, sometimes triggered by sounds or sudden silence. Sophie occasionally woke up crying. Lucy had moments where she asked in her small voice if Greg would come back, but those moments passed and they passed together. No one had to carry them alone anymore. One quiet evening, while tucking Lucy into bed, Rachel found her holding a drawing. It showed 4 stick figures, 2 adults, 2 kids. All were holding hands. Over the picture in large uneven letters, Lucy had written *my family*. Rachel showed it to Evan later, her hands trembling. He didn't say much. He just held the paper, then held her. That was the thing about this story. It didn't end in applause or fireworks. It ended in something better. In safety, in love rebuilt, in everyday miracles, and in the quiet, steady truth that family is not always about blood or timing or perfection. Sometimes it's about choosing to stay, choosing to show up, choosing to begin again. And in that choice, they had found something lasting, not just survival, but home. What makes the ending of this story powerful isn't that everything turns out perfectly, but that it turns out honestly. It's not a fairy tale, and that's what gives it real emotional weight. The characters don't simply erase their pain. They learn to live with it, to grow from it, and to choose love and healing every single day, even when it's hard. For me, the most meaningful part is how the story shows that family isn't defined by the beginning. It's defined by what you do when it counts. Evan didn't know he had a daughter, and Rachel made mistakes out of fear and survival. But when it mattered most, they showed up. Not with perfection, but with presence. And sometimes that's more than enough. The final image, Lucy's drawing for figures holding hands, labeled simply, "My family," says everything. In the end, it's not about getting back what was lost. It's about building something new, something chosen, and something that lasts. That's the kind of ending that stays with you.